Clara tightened the strap of her worn satchel as the sun dipped. Low behind the jagged horizon, the desert stretched endlessly before her, a sea of gold and orange, with shadows stretching like silent fingers across the dunes. She had walked further than she realized, driven by necessity and fear alike. Her small town no longer welcomed her, whispers of judgment following every step she had taken for the past year. Now, as the wind picked up and sand hissed across the rocks, she was utterly alone. Her heart beat fast, not just from the walk, but from the mounting realization that the desert did not forgive hesitation. Every step she took sank into the fine grains, the wind pulling at her skirts and hair, whipping her face with gritty whispers. She could feel the night coming, a creeping chill that would turn the scorching days into freezing darkness. Shelter was not an option. Survival was the only plan. As Clara scanned the horizon, she saw it, a faint silhouette, almost blending with the warm ochre tones of the desert. An abandoned train station, its wooden planks bleached and cracked by time, stood like a lonely sentinel in the middle of nowhere. Relief and trepidation mingled in her chest. The station promised safety, yet she could sense the shadows within, holding stories of the past, of travelers long gone, and perhaps secrets best left untouched. She approached carefully, every step deliberate, listening for any sound that might reveal life or danger inside. The wind moaned, rattling the broken windows and sending boards creaking against one another. And then she saw him. He lay in the corner, partially hidden by shadows, his movements slow and deliberate. Thomas, a man of the desert by necessity, or perhaps by fate, lifted his eyes to hers, a wary spark glinting in the dim light. He was wounded, though it was not immediately clear how badly. Clara's first instinct was to flee, but her survival instincts, honed by years of careful caution, told her to stay. They were two strangers in a harsh world, each reliant on the other whether they liked it or not. Carefully, she set down her satchel and removed the small water bottle she carried. Every drop counted. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her voice almost lost in the desert wind, still sneaking through the cracks in the station walls. Thomas flinched but did not move away. His lips tightened, and a nod came slowly. The wound on his arm was shallow, but deep enough that he could not treat it alone. Clara, who had never been a healer, used what little knowledge she had learned from her mother years ago. Bandages wrapped tight, water dabbed to clean the scrape, all while they exchanged only short, cautious words. Night descended fully, and with it, the wind grew colder, sharp against the skin. Clara shivered but focused on keeping the small fire of trust alive between them. Conversation started hesitantly, stories about towns they had known, mistakes they had made, and the loneliness that had brought each here. Hours passed. The moon rose high, a silver sentinel above the desert sands. Clara realized that fear had been replaced by something more subtle, something warmer. Even as the wind continued its wailing chorus, she felt a fragile connection growing, a bond forged not in romance, but in survival and understanding. Thomas, for his part, had not spoken of his past in full, only fragments of the danger that pursued him, the men who had left him injured and on the run. Yet there was a quiet relief in his eyes that someone, anyone, was there, listening and offering aid. He did not need words for what he felt. Clara understood it in the small gestures, the careful way he allowed her to tend to him, the way he moved to shield her from the gusting wind whenever it blew sand too close. The night stretched endlessly, but not cruelly. They kept watch for one another, shared the small rations of water Clara had carried, and in silence found something akin to peace. Every crack of the old boards, every whisper of the wind, seemed to etch their names into the empty desert, marking them as two lives intersecting for one night in a vast, uncaring wilderness. By the time the first hints of dawn painted the sky in soft pinks and blues, Thomas moved to prepare for departure. There were no declarations, no dramatic farewells. He handed Clara a small satchel containing water, a few preserved rations, and a crude map marking the safest path through the desert ahead. His eyes met hers, and in them, a silent understanding passed. He would disappear into the sands, but the night would leave an imprint on them both, unspoken but indelible. Clara watched him mount his horse, moving with a grace honed by necessity, his silhouette fading against the dawn. She felt the desert differently now, not just as a place of danger, but as a test she had survived. Thomas had not just given her supplies, he had given her something far more important. The knowledge that she could endure, that she could find strength she never knew existed. She took a deep breath of the cool morning air, the wind carrying the scent of sand, dust, and distant sage. For the first time in a long while, she did not feel entirely alone. The frontier was silent again, but Clara's heart was awake, resilient, and full of a quiet determination. She stepped out into the sunlit desert, ready to continue her journey, carrying with her the lessons of the night and the silent bond she would never forget. Clara tightened her satchel, feeling the weight not just of supplies but of the lessons the desert had already taught her. Each step over the shifting sands felt heavier and yet more purposeful. She recalled Thomas's quiet gaze, the way he had vanished into the early morning haze without a word, leaving behind only a map and a small satchel. It was enough, not just physically but mentally, to ignite a spark of hope and determination she hadn't felt in months. The path Thomas had marked wound through a series of low ridges and sun-baked valleys, seemingly endless, yet deceptively simple. For miles the horizon remained uniform, the sun blinding and unforgiving, the sand stretching like a golden ocean. Clara's mind wandered as her feet sank into the grains, thinking of the towns she had left behind, the whispered judgments, the walls she had built around her heart. And yet she felt lighter somehow, as though one night with a stranger had unburdened her in ways she could not fully name. As midday approached, the desert heat became relentless. Clara rested in the sparse shade of a lone, twisted mesquite tree. She pulled out a few sips of water from the satchel Thomas had given her, savoring each drop, aware of how precious it was. Hunger gnawed lightly at her stomach, but fear and fatigue were absent, replaced by a new awareness. Survival was no longer just a matter of necessity, but of choice, of will. Hours passed, shadows shifted, and the desert began to show its hidden beauty. The golden dunes glowing like molten glass, the distant mountains standing like silent guardians, the occasional lizard darting across the cracked earth. Clara felt a quiet awe at the vastness surrounding her, a sense that the world was larger than her fears, larger than her past, and filled with possibilities she had never dared to imagine. Even as the sun began its descent, casting long, dramatic shadows across the dunes, Clara noticed movement ahead. A small group of riders approached from the ridge, dust clouds billowing behind them, the rhythmic clatter of hooves marking their pace. She froze, instinctively ducking behind a small rise. The riders were strangers, cloaked in dust and mystery, their faces obscured by scarves and wide-brimmed hats. They moved with a purpose, yet there was a certain hesitation, as if the desert itself dictated their pace. Clara weighed her options. Retreating back was impossible. The desert behind her was a vast expanse with no shelter. Moving forward could be dangerous. Strangers in the frontier often meant trouble. But the night with Thomas had changed something fundamental within her. Fear no longer dictated her choices. She drew a deep breath and stepped forward into the open, hands raised slightly to show she meant no harm. The lead rider noticed her immediately. He slowed, exchanging glances with his companions. Their eyes, sharp and cautious, assessed her in seconds. Clara's heart beat faster, but not with fear. Instead, she felt a strange exhilaration, as though this encounter, whether friend or foe, was part of a grander story unfolding, a story she was finally part of, rather than simply enduring. "Who are you?" the lead rider called, his voice rough but not unkind. Clara answered honestly, her words clear over the wind. "I'm Clara. I'm just trying to reach the nearest settlement. I'm alone." She held up the satchel Thomas had given her, a silent proof of her journey and her survival skills. The rider's eyes softened slightly. The desert isn't kind to the unprepared. You're lucky, he said, gesturing for her to ride alongside them. Clara hesitated only briefly, then climbed onto a small borrowed horse. The animal calmed beneath her careful touch. The riders welcomed her into their circle, their silence speaking volumes. Though she had only just met them, Clara sensed a shared understanding, a collective respect for the hardships of the frontier, and the unspoken truth that survival often demanded alliances, temporary or otherwise. The sun continued its slow descent, painting the desert sky in hues of crimson and gold. Clara rode among the strangers, absorbing the rhythm of their journey. Every gust of wind, every crunch of sand under hooves, was a reminder that the frontier was alive, challenging, and utterly indifferent to human struggles. Yet within this indifference, there was beauty and a chance for connection, however fleeting. As night approached, the group made camp near a rocky outcrop. A small fire was kindled, its warm glow dancing across Clara's face. The riders shared tales of the desert, of lost towns, hidden dangers, and miraculous survivals. Clara listened intently, feeling her own story weaving silently into theirs, a quiet thread connecting her night with Thomas to this new chapter of her journey. By the time the stars stretched across the ink-black sky, Clara felt a sense of belonging she had never known. The desert, once a place of solitude and fear, had become a stage for discovery, of courage, of human connection, and of the resilience of her own spirit. Though Thomas was gone, the night she had spent with him lingered as a quiet strength within her. She curled up beside the fire, the desert night wrapping her like a protective cloak. Tomorrow she would ride onward, facing unknown paths, dangers, and perhaps new friendships. But tonight the desert was a companion, a silent witness to her growing courage, and to the unfolding story of a stranger in the desert who had changed her life forever. The night deepened, and Clara lay beside the flickering fire, listening to the wind sweep across the desert. The riders had drifted into quiet conversations, their voices low, filled with tales of frontier survival, though she had just met them. Clara felt a growing sense of trust, a fragile bond that the desert, harsh as it was, seemed to respect. Yet the desert was never truly silent. Shadows moved among the distant rocks, and the whispering wind carried sounds that the untrained ear could not catch. Clara's instincts, honed during her night with Thomas, prickled at her. Danger was near, though invisible, like a predator stalking in the golden sands. Morning came slowly, painting the sky in soft hues of pink and lavender. The group prepared to ride, and Clara's small horse pawed the ground nervously. She checked the satchel Thomas had given her, the map now her lifeline through this vast, indifferent wilderness. Every step she took now was deliberate, calculated, aware that the desert could turn from beauty to death in a heartbeat. The lead rider, a tall man with a sharp gaze named Elias, noticed her hesitancy. "The frontier tests us all," he said quietly, his voice carrying over the soft rustle of the wind. "Stay alert and trust your instincts. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes." They rode in a loose formation, the sun climbing higher, the heat already baking the earth. Clara followed closely, absorbing every nuance of the desert landscape. The dunes that shifted like waves, the sparse vegetation, and the occasional distant shadow that hinted at life or threat. Each rock and ridge could hide danger, from snakes to bandits, and the knowledge made her pulse quicken. Hours passed in tense silence. The desert stretched endlessly, unbroken except by the occasional mesa or the faint outline of a distant canyon. And then Clara noticed it, a movement at the edge of her vision. 3 figures, partially hidden by the rocks, moving with intent. Bandits, raiders, or perhaps travelers like themselves, yet armed with unknown motives. She signaled to Elias, who brought the group to a cautious halt. The riders dismounted silently, drawing their weapons while maintaining calm. Clara's heart pounded, but she remembered the lessons from her night with Thomas. Patience, awareness, and quiet observation could often save more lives than rash action. The approaching figures slowed as well, their hands visible, unthreatening at first glance, but weapons partially concealed. Words were exchanged, tense and measured, revealing a misunderstanding. They were a small merchant party, lost in the desert and wary of strangers. Just as Clara and her group were cautious of them, relief washed over her, though it was tempered by a new awareness. The desert was unpredictable, and threats could emerge from both the natural and human world. The riders shared supplies with the merchants, water and rations carefully measured and exchanged, creating a temporary alliance born of necessity. Clara watched, fascinated by the way trust and cooperation could blossom even in the harshest conditions. As the sun began to dip, casting long shadows across the sand, the group reached a rocky outcrop where they could rest safely. Clara and the merchants shared stories by the fire, laughter mingling with the wind for the first time in days. She felt a sense of belonging, a quiet affirmation that even in isolation, human connection could endure. But as night fully enveloped the desert, Clara sensed it, the lingering presence of danger, subtle yet undeniable. Something about the silence beyond the firelight, the unnatural stillness in the air spoke of trials yet to come. She felt it in her bones. The desert had more lessons to teach, and her journey was far from over. Clara lay down beneath the stars, the vast expanse above her reminding her of both her vulnerability and her growing resilience. She thought of Thomas, of the silent strength he had instilled in her, and felt a quiet determination. No matter what the desert held in store, she would endure, she would survive, and she would face the unknown with courage, carrying the invisible thread of connection from her night with the stranger, who had changed her life forever. The desert night pressed down upon Clara like a living thing, vast and quiet, yet brimming with unseen movement. The fire flickered beside her, casting elongated shadows across the rocky outcrop, dancing in rhythm with the wind. Though the merchant party had retreated into a small, temporary camp, Clara's mind refused rest. The lessons of survival from her night with Thomas replayed over and over. Trust measured carefully, observation constant, heart steady. She rose quietly, stepping a few paces away from the fire to peer across the dunes. The moonlight gleamed off the sand, transforming the barren landscape into a silver sea. Clara felt the desert's dual nature, both beautiful and perilous. Every ridge could conceal danger, every shadow could conceal a story, and every gust of wind could bring both life and death. Her thoughts drifted back to her hometown, to the narrow streets and whispered conversations she had escaped from. She had always felt trapped by expectation, by judgment, by the invisible chains of society. The desert had no chains, no whispers, only the raw truth of existence. She was free, but freedom demanded responsibility and courage, qualities she had only begun to understand. Suddenly, movement at the far edge of the dunes caught her attention. A figure emerged, moving deliberately, carefully, almost as though gliding over the sand. Clara's heart leapt, but not with fear. She remembered Thomas's calm confidence, the way he had faced the desert's dangers with measured patience. She waited, crouched low behind a small ridge, eyes narrowing. The figure came closer. As it approached, she saw that it was an older woman, draped in tattered robes, eyes sharp and wary. She carried a staff that had clearly been used for both travel and defense, and her face bore the lines of countless journeys through the desert. The woman stopped a short distance from Clara, studying the camp with quiet intensity. Clara stepped forward, raising her hand slightly in a gesture of peace. "I mean no harm," she called softly. The woman's eyes flicked toward her, narrowing before slowly relaxing. "You're far from home, child," she said in a voice as dry and rough as the desert winds. "The desert teaches all who enter its realm, whether they want the lessons or not." Her words carried a weight Clara could feel in her chest. There was no judgment, only observation, a mirror of what she had been learning within herself. The woman introduced herself as Mara, a wanderer of the frontier, someone who had survived the desert's merciless trials and carried the wisdom of years etched into every movement, every glance. Mara joined the campfire, sharing stories of survival, of dangers faced and overcome, of companions lost and lessons gained. Clara listened, enraptured. The woman's tales resonated deeply, echoing her own night with Thomas.
Here was proof that courage,
resourcefulness, and empathy could endure, even in a world as indifferent and harsh as the desert. As the fire burned low, Mara pulled Clara aside. "The desert does not forgive weakness," she said quietly, her eyes piercing through the shadows. "But it rewards those who understand it, who respect it, and who keep their hearts steady. You are not as lost as you think, but the trials ahead will test more than your body. They will test your spirit." Clara absorbed the words, the desert's chill sinking into her bones, the warmth of the fire illuminating the path forward. She understood now that survival was not just about avoiding danger or finding shelter. It was about growth, resilience, and the strength of the human heart. Her night with Thomas, the allies she had found, and the lessons Mara imparted, all of it had shaped her into someone capable of facing the unknown with determination. When the stars were high and the desert quiet once more, Clara returned to her tent, her thoughts filled with possibilities, strategies, and newfound courage. She realized that the journey ahead would not just be a test of endurance, but a journey into herself, discovering strength, compassion, and wisdom in a place where the world seemed silent yet endlessly alive. The desert was vast, indifferent and challenging, but Clara was no longer afraid. The stranger who had changed her life had ignited a fire within her, and now, guided by her own heart and the lessons of those she encountered, she was ready to face whatever the frontier had in store. The desert morning arrived in a silence so profound it pressed against Clara's ears. The wind had died overnight, leaving only the whisper of shifting sands and the occasional cry of a distant bird. She rose early, feeling the stiffness in her muscles from days of travel and nights under the open sky. Yet the stiffness was welcome. It reminded her that she was alive, that she had survived each trial the desert had presented so far. Mara was already awake, tending a small fire and studying the horizon. The older woman's eyes were sharp, scanning the distant dunes as if she could read the movements of the wind itself. "A storm is coming," she said quietly when Clara approached. "The desert does not announce its fury. You must be ready or it will consume you." Clara looked to the horizon. The sky, once a perfect expanse of pale blue, had darkened, streaked with clouds of dust and ash. The edges of the dunes seemed to ripple unnaturally, and the heat carried a tension that raised goosebumps on her arms. The desert had always been dangerous, but now it seemed as though it were alive with intent, testing her resolve once more. The riders, aware of the incoming storm, quickly broke camp. Horses were saddled, supplies packed, and the merchant party, who had begun to trust Clara and her companions, followed in cautious formation. The air was thick with anticipation. Every eye scanned the sky, every ear listened for the first whisper of wind that would signal the storm's arrival. As they rode, the temperature began to drop. The warm sands of the day turned cold beneath the hooves of the horses, and the first grains of sand whipped across their faces. Clara pulled her scarf tighter around her mouth and nose, trying to protect herself from the desert's fury. She glanced at Mara, who rode calmly, a pillar of experience, guiding the group with steady hands and unshakable confidence. Hours passed, the storm growing in intensity. The riders huddled close, moving with precision through the dunes as if reading the subtle signs of the desert. Clara felt fear for the first time in days, not the fear of being alone, but of forces beyond her control. The storm was vast, indifferent, and unrelenting. Yet within her, she felt the calm strength that Thomas had inspired in her, the courage that had carried her through the night she first met him. Suddenly, a loud crack split the air, a rock slide from a nearby ridge, loosened by the shifting winds. Horses reared, and the group scrambled for safety. Clara's horse bolted briefly, but she managed to regain control, her heart pounding wildly. Mara appeared at her side, steadying her horse and whispering, "Focus. Calm the heart, and the desert will follow your lead." the storm hit in full force just as they reached a narrow canyon. Dust and sand swirling around them like a living wall. Visibility dropped to mere feet. Every step became a test of navigation, of patience, and of trust. Clara relied on the small landmarks Thomas had marked on the map, adjusting her path with meticulous care. The riders ahead shouted warnings, their voices swallowed by the roaring wind. Hours of struggle followed, the group moving at a slow, grueling pace. Clara's clothes were plastered with sand, her hands raw from gripping the reins, yet she pressed on. Driven not just by survival instinct, but by a newfound determination. This storm, fierce and unforgiving, had become a crucible, refining her courage and sharpening her senses. Finally, just as the sun began to dip toward the horizon again, the storm eased, leaving behind a transformed desert. The dunes had shifted, revealing new paths and obscuring others. The group paused, breathing heavily, feeling the weight of what they had endured. Clara looked to Mara, whose face bore both relief and a subtle pride. "You survived," Mara said softly, her voice almost drowned by the desert's returning calm. "The desert tests those it deems worthy. Remember this night, it will guide you in the days to come." Clara mounted her horse, her heart still racing but her mind clear. She realized that each trial, each danger, each challenge had shaped her into someone stronger, someone capable of enduring the unforgiving wilderness and the unpredictability of human nature. Thomas had ignited the spark, and now through storms and shadows, Clara's courage burned brighter than ever. As they rode onward into the twilight, the desert stretching endlessly ahead, Clara understood a truth that resonated deep within her. Survival was only the beginning. The frontier was a teacher, and she was ready to learn all it had to offer. The desert had quieted after the storm, leaving a surreal calm in its wake. The sands gleamed faintly under the golden glow of the late afternoon sun, as if nothing had disturbed their surface at all. But Clara knew better. The storm had shifted the landscape, erased landmarks, and revealed new paths. It had tested her resolve, her instincts, and her courage, and she had emerged stronger. Though every muscle ached from the struggle, the riders continued in tight formation, now more alert than ever. Each one carried the scars of experience, eyes constantly scanning the horizon for hidden dangers. Clara rode beside Mara, whose calm presence was a beacon in the harsh wilderness. "The desert hides more than storms," Mara said quietly. "It hides people, choices, and consequences. Trust is precious here, and you must be discerning." Clara nodded, absorbing every word. Her journey with Thomas, her encounter with the merchant party, and the recent storm had taught her survival. But the lessons of trust and human nature were only beginning. As they crested a small dune, Clara noticed movement ahead. Two figures emerged, partially hidden in the shadows of a rocky outcrop. Unlike the previous merchant party, these strangers radiated tension and caution. They were armed, yet their posture suggested fear more than aggression. Clara slowed, letting the riders stop with her, and observed carefully. The lead rider, Elias, approached the strangers with a cautious greeting. Words were exchanged, tense and measured, revealing that the newcomers were lost scouts from a distant settlement. They had been separated from their group during the storm, carrying vital information about supplies, water sources, and potential dangers ahead. Clara's heart lifted. These allies would be invaluable for navigating the increasingly treacherous desert. Mara introduced herself and Clara to the scouts, her voice carrying authority and calm. The desert demanded respect, and these newcomers had earned a wary trust. Clara listened intently as they shared maps, survival tips, and warnings of hostile terrain further along the route. Every detail was a lifeline, a small beacon guiding her steps through a world where a single misstep could be fatal. As night fell, the group set up a secure camp in a natural alcove, shielded from the winds and exposed dunes. Fires were lit carefully, and food and water rations were distributed with precision. Clara sat beside Mara, her hands wrapped around a small cup of water, reflecting on the day's events. The desert had provided both danger and allies, shaping her journey in ways she had not anticipated. But the night was not without tension. Whispered conversations revealed that the scouts carried secrets, rumors of bandits, operating further along the route, and hints of a man who might be following them. Someone who had crossed paths with Thomas. Clara's heart raced at the thought. Could the stranger who had changed her life still be involved? Or was this another trial the desert had placed in her path? Mara noticed Clara's unease. "Worrying about things you cannot see will only weaken you," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Focus on what you can control, and the desert will teach you the rest." Clara took a deep breath, letting the words sink in. She realized that fear had no power unless she allowed it, and that courage was more than surviving storms. It was confronting uncertainty with clarity and strength. As the stars emerged overhead, Clara reflected on how far she had come. From the first night alone in the desert with Thomas, to surviving the storm, to forming fragile alliances with strangers. Each experience had shaped her. She felt a deepening awareness of the world around her, the fragility of life, and the power of human connection in even the harshest conditions. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring new challenges, perhaps confrontations with bandits, or tests of trust with the scouts. But tonight, under the quiet, star-strewn sky, Clara felt a sense of peace. She was not the same woman who had entered the desert days ago. She was stronger, wiser, and ready to face whatever trials awaited her. The desert, vast and indifferent, had begun to reveal its secrets, and Clara, guided by courage, intuition, and the lessons of the night that had changed her life, was prepared to uncover them all. The next morning, the desert greeted Clara with an eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional whisper of wind. The path ahead twisted through narrow canyons and jagged ridges, the kind of terrain that favored ambushes. Clara rode beside Mara and the lead rider, Elias, whose experience in the frontier was evident in every cautious step of the horse. The scouts moved ahead, eyes scanning the dunes. Clara felt a subtle tension in the air, a ripple she had learned to notice since her first night in the desert. Danger was coming, though it had not yet revealed itself fully. She gripped the reins tighter, her thoughts drifting to Thomas. Could he have known this danger existed? Or was this yet another test the desert had designed for her? The first sign came in the form of dust. Clouds on the horizon, too organized to be a mirage. Riders approached fast, their movements purposeful. Bandits. Clara's heart hammered in her chest. But she did not panic. She had survived storms, treacherous paths, and the weight of uncertainty. She would face this challenge too. Elias gestured for the group to dismount, leading them into a hidden alcove between rocks. The bandits rode past, scanning the terrain, unaware of the small group lying in wait. Clara could see the fear in their eyes, the arrogance of men untested by the harshness of the desert. The lesson was clear. Power without respect for the land and its rules could be fatal. Mara whispered, "We must act carefully. These men are reckless, but clever enough to kill if cornered. Observe, wait, and choose the right moment." Clara nodded, every muscle tense, every sense alive. Her journey had trained her well. She could anticipate movement, read intention, and prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. Hours passed as they maneuvered through the rocky terrain, the bandits' shadows lingering like a threat over every dune. Clara felt the bond with her companions deepen. Trust, forged in fire, storms, and shared trials, now became their greatest weapon. Together, they were more than individuals. They were a unit, a small force capable of confronting the desert and its dangers. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the dunes, the bandits attempted a direct approach, unaware of the trap set by Elias and Mara. Clara's pulse quickened, but she stayed calm, her eyes fixed on the lead bandit, a tall man with a cruel smile. She had learned to read people as well as the desert. Fear, arrogance, desperation, it all lay bare in posture and gesture. With precise timing, Mara gave a subtle signal. The riders struck in unison, disarming the bandits and forcing them into surrender. Clara watched, awe and fear mingling in her chest. As the bandits realized the futility of resistance, she had never imagined herself capable of orchestrating such an encounter. Yet here she was, alive, alert, and in control. After the confrontation, Clara approached the subdued bandits. Her voice was calm but firm. The desert teaches its lessons in many ways. Let this be yours. The men chastened nodded silently. The lesson of humility and respect was one they would carry forward, just as Clara had learned hers through storms, solitude, and survival. Night fell again over the desert, quieter this time. The threat diminished, but the lessons etched deeply. Clara lay beside the fire, feeling stronger, braver, and more aware of her own resilience. She knew now that the desert's dangers were not just natural, they were human, and each encounter tested courage, wisdom, and compassion. As the stars stretched across the sky, Clara thought of Thomas. The stranger who had changed her life had ignited a spark, and every challenge since then had fanned it into a flame. She realized that the frontier was not just a place of survival, it was a crucible for character, shaping those willing to face its trials with heart, courage, and hope. The desert dawn arrived in a muted glow, soft and deceptive. Clara rose quietly, feeling the soreness of yesterday's ordeal in every muscle. The confrontation with the bandits had tested her courage, her instincts, and her ability to act decisively under pressure. Yet with every trial, she felt herself becoming stronger, more attuned to the rhythm of the desert and the unspoken lessons it offered. Mara and Elias led the group along a narrow, rocky pass, following the guidance of the scouts who had joined them days earlier. Their pace was careful, deliberate, aware that the desert was a land that demanded respect and patience. Clara's eyes scanned every ridge, every dune, watching for movement, listening for sounds barely perceptible to the untrained ear. Hours passed under the relentless sun. Supplies were low and the heat pressed down on the travelers, heavy and exhausting. Just as fatigue threatened to sap their resolve, one of the scouts shouted from the front. Clara squinted against the light and saw it, a glimmer of water reflecting the sun, hidden among a cluster of rocky outcrops. An oasis. The group moved quickly but cautiously, aware that even a blessing in the desert could hide dangers. Clara felt a surge of relief and awe. After days of relentless heat, storms, and treacherous terrain, water and shade were more than survival. They were a reminder of the desert's hidden generosity. As they approached the oasis, palm trees swayed gently in a breeze that felt almost miraculous. A small spring gurgled softly, its crystal-clear water inviting and cool. Clara knelt beside it, cupping her hands to drink, the water running through her fingers as if washing away not just dust and sweat, but fear, doubt, and exhaustion. She had survived storms, faced danger, and endured the harsh lessons of the desert. Now she could feel the strength of her own heart, the resilience Thomas had glimpsed in her the first night, fully awakened. The oasis also offered shelter, a place to rest and recover. Fires were lit cautiously, meals prepared with care, and water rationed wisely. The group, united by shared trials, felt a sense of peace that the desert rarely allowed. Even the scouts, initially wary and distant, shared laughter and stories, their voices mingling with the soft rustle of palm leaves and the gentle trickle of the spring. Yet Clara sensed the desert's quiet warning beneath the calm. She remembered Mara's words. The desert rewards those who respect it, but it never stops testing them. Even in this oasis, surrounded by beauty and reprieve, danger lingered. It could be human, natural, or simply a test of vigilance and courage. As the sun sank toward the horizon, painting the oasis in golden light, Clara reflected on how far she had come. She had arrived in the desert a cautious, lonely woman. She had faced storms, threats, and the vast isolation of the wilderness. She had learned trust, courage, and the subtle wisdom of observing before acting. And now in the quiet embrace of the oasis, she felt a profound connection to the desert, to her companions, and to herself. Night fell over the oasis, stars scattered like diamonds across the dark sky. Clara lay beneath a palm, the gentle sounds of the spring lulling her into a rare, deep rest. She dreamed of Thomas, of Mara, of the bandits subdued, and of the endless dunes beyond the oasis. Every experience had shaped her. Every encounter had strengthened her resolve. and every step had prepared her for the ultimate challenges still ahead. Tomorrow, she knew, would take her deeper into the desert, closer to both danger and revelation. But tonight, Clara allowed herself a quiet triumph. She had survived, she had grown, and the desert, once a harsh, indifferent teacher, had begun to reveal the wisdom she needed to complete her journey. The morning air at the oasis was cool, but Clara sensed the tension in the desert beyond the palms. The calm had been a brief reprieve. The desert never allowed complacency. She mounted her horse with a new determination, feeling the quiet strength that had been building inside her since the night she first met Thomas. Every trial, every storm, every shadow had carved courage into her spirit. The group moved out of the oasis carefully, following the winding trails Mara and the scouts had charted. The landscape changed subtly. The dunes gave way to jagged rocks, deep canyons and narrow ridges. Each step demanded vigilance. Clara noticed small signs that the desert had left for those willing to read them. Animal tracks, the slight shift of sand, distant echoes that could warn of movement beyond sight. By mid-afternoon, the group reached a canyon whose walls rose like jagged teeth from the desert floor. Mara's voice was calm but urgent. This passage tests more than strength. It tests judgment, patience, and heart. Watch carefully. Every choice here matters. Clara led her horse forward, her pulse steady. The canyon was treacherous. Loose rocks threatened footing, and shadows danced ominously across the walls. A sudden shift of sand beneath her horse's hooves caused a stumble, and Clara leaned instinctively, steadying the animal. The heart-pounding moment reminded her that even a small mistake in the desert could carry grave consequences. The group pressed on, each step a lesson in precision and trust. The bandits they had encountered before had left subtle traps along the edges, remnants of human greed and malice. Clara noticed them: buried pits, disturbed rocks, faint footprints leading toward dangerous cliffs. Her instincts, sharpened by past trials, guided her safely past each one. Hours passed as the canyon narrowed, shadows deepening with the late sun. Clara felt the weight of solitude despite being surrounded by her companions. The canyon's walls echoed the whispers of the desert, reminders of isolation, resilience, and survival. She recalled Thomas's eyes, the quiet trust he had placed in her the first night, and felt a renewed sense of purpose. Suddenly, the sound of movement ahead froze her heart. A figure emerged from the shadows, a man, cloaked in dust, eyes sharp and calculating. Clara recognized the stance immediately, trained, dangerous, and persistent. The desert had brought her face to face with a follower of Thomas, someone connected to the first night that had changed her life. The encounter was tense. Words were few. The man's intentions were unclear, but his presence was a test, one that Clara knew she could not avoid. Mara and Elias positioned themselves strategically, while Clara stood her ground, heart steady, eyes locked on the stranger. Hours passed in cautious observation, the desert around them silent but threatening. Clara realized that this was the culmination of her journey so far, the ultimate trial of patience, judgment, and courage. She had survived storms, bandits, isolation, and danger, and now she faced a confrontation that was as much about understanding human nature as surviving the wilderness. Through careful conversation and measured observation, Clara discerned the man's motives. He sought information about Thomas, testing her loyalty and courage. Instead of fear, Clara responded with calm intelligence, offering truth without betrayal, strength without arrogance. The desert had taught her well. Every interaction, every decision was a reflection of her heart and character. By the time the sun dipped below the canyon walls, the stranger had departed, leaving Clara and her companions intact. The trial had passed, leaving behind lessons deeper than any storm or ambush: patience, wisdom, and the quiet power of courage tempered by compassion. Clara exhaled, feeling the weight of days and nights spent in the desert lift slightly. She had faced the shadows of fear, both human and natural, and emerged stronger. The desert had tested her, shaped her, and prepared her for the final leg of her journey, a leg that would reveal the deepest truths of her heart and the enduring bond that had begun with a stranger in the desert. The first light of dawn crept over the dunes, painting the desert in soft hues of gold and rose. Clara stood atop a small ridge, the wind whispering across her face, carrying the scent of sand, distant rocks, and the faint fragrance of desert blooms. She had traveled farther than she ever imagined possible, endured storms, faced bandits, and learned the subtle lessons of trust, courage, and human connection. Beside her, Mara and Elias observed the horizon. The scouts had gone ahead to ensure the path was safe, leaving Clara with a moment of quiet reflection. She thought of Thomas, the stranger who had changed her life. Their night in the desert had sparked something that had grown with each trial, each encounter, each lesson learned in the harsh wilderness. The final stretch of the journey awaited, a vast plateau overlooked by jagged cliffs, rumored to hide a settlement where travelers could find refuge, information and guidance for the next stage of their lives. Clara's heart pounded, not with fear, but with anticipation. She had come so far, faced so much, and now the desert seemed to acknowledge her resilience. The path through the plateau was treacherous. Loose rocks, hidden ravines, and sudden gusts of wind demanded complete focus. Clara's senses, sharpened through days of vigilance, guided her and her horse with precision. Mara rode beside her, a steady presence, offering guidance when the terrain shifted unexpectedly. Midway through the plateau, Clara spotted movement in the distance, a small caravan, traveling carefully along the edge of the cliffs. Recognition struck her immediately. It was Thomas riding among them, older and more weathered from his own journey, but unmistakably the same man who had changed her life that first night. Time seemed to pause as their eyes met across the vast desert. He smiled, a quiet, knowing smile, and Clara felt the weight of everything they had both endured. The desert, harsh and indifferent, had shaped them both. It had tested their courage, resilience, and hearts, and now, in this rare moment of connection, it offered something it rarely granted, a gift. She approached slowly, careful to keep her composure, though her heart raced. Thomas dismounted, walking toward her across the warm sands. Words were unnecessary. The bond forged in the first night of the desert had endured, strengthened by trials, separation, and the raw beauty of survival. "Clara," he said softly, "the desert brought us together for a reason." Her response was a smile, a mixture of relief, joy, and quiet understanding. She had survived storms, bandits, isolation, and trials that had tested her heart and spirit. And now, at the culmination of her journey, she understood the truth Thomas had silently imparted that first night. Courage, empathy, and resilience were the greatest treasures the desert could offer. They rode together toward the settlement side by side, the golden sands stretching endlessly beneath the morning sun. Behind them, Mara and the remaining companions followed, a testament to the connections forged in adversity, the alliances born of necessity, and the enduring power of human kindness in a world that often seemed indifferent. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the settlement appeared on the horizon, a cluster of adobe buildings and palm trees, the promise of shelter, guidance, and new beginnings. Clara felt a sense of completion, yet also anticipation. This journey had changed her, but the lessons of the desert would remain forever. As she entered the settlement with Thomas, Clara realized that the desert's greatest gift was not survival alone. It was transformation. She had learned to trust herself, to face fear with courage, to understand the hearts of others, and to embrace the unknown with hope. The desert had tested her, shaped her, and ultimately gifted her with strength, wisdom, and an enduring connection that would guide her for the rest of her life. The sun blazed above, warming the sand and illuminating the horizon. Clara looked toward the endless dunes, her heart full. She was no longer the woman who had wandered alone into the desert. She was a survivor, a traveler, a heart awakened by the trials and gifts of a harsh, beautiful land. And in that moment she knew her story, like the desert itself, was timeless, unforgettable, and alive with the promise of new beginnings. The journey was complete, yet the lessons of the desert would echo in her heart forever, a story of courage, connection, and the stranger who had changed her life in ways words could barely capture.